Her thumb hovered over the call button, then drifted away before touching the glass, the screen dimming as if it had lost interest in her. And a second later, she tapped it again just to wake it, not to use it, only to watch the light return and fade, a quiet pulse in the center of an otherwise still room. The office stretched around her in long, clean lines, glass walls reflecting a version of her that did not move any faster than she did, which was not at all. Her chair angled slightly off from the desk as if she had meant to stand up minutes ago and never finished the thought. A ceramic mug resting near her elbow with a thin ring of coffee cooling untouched, the surface no longer steaming but not yet forgotten, just waiting in that in-between state she seemed to occupy too. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows the city moved in steady currents, headlights threading through avenues, signals changing on schedule, everything continuing with or without her, though from this height the motion felt distant, like something happening on a muted screen. She leaned back a fraction, not enough to relax, just enough for the chair to creak softly beneath her weight, her shoulders lowering half an inch before settling again. And for a moment her eyes drifted from the phone to the reflection in the glass, catching the faint outline of her own face layered over the city lights, not studying it, not correcting it, simply noticing it was there. The overhead lighting hummed at a low, consistent frequency, too quiet to be heard when she first sat down, but now it pressed gently into the silence, filling the spaces between her breaths, which had slowed without her realizing, lengthening just slightly as if the room itself had stretched time. She reached for the mug, fingers brushing the handle, then stopped before lifting it, her hand resting there a second longer than necessary before pulling back, leaving the cup exactly where it had been, the ring beneath it, widening by a fraction. Somewhere down the corridor, far enough to be almost indistinct, came the soft, rhythmic sound of wheels gliding over polished tile, a faint swish and pause, the kind of sound that belonged to maintenance hours, to people who moved through spaces after everyone else had already decided to leave. And it continued without variation, never approaching quickly, never retreating completely, just existing at the edge of her awareness like a metronome set to a slower tempo. The lights in the outer offices clicked off one section at a time, not abruptly, but in a sequence, each dimming, leaving behind a slightly deeper shadow that did not quite reach her corner. The brightness above her remaining steady, isolated, as if her presence alone justified it, or perhaps simply delayed its absence. She picked up the phone again, not to check anything new, only to tilt it, watching how the glow shifted across her palm, then set it down with the same care she might have used if it mattered, aligning it with the edge of the desk before nudging it a fraction out of place again. A small correction that did not correct anything. The swish of wheels grew marginally clearer now, not closer in distance so much as more defined in the quiet. And in the reflection, she could just make out a shape passing across the far end of the hallway, a figure moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm, head slightly lowered, hands occupied, not looking toward her, not needing to, continuing on the same path that would bring him past, and then beyond without interruption, his presence as ordinary as the dimming lights, as constant as the hum above, and for a brief second, her gaze shifted in that direction, not fully turning, just enough to acknowledge movement before settling back on the darkened screen, which had already faded again. The screen stayed dark a little longer this time before she reached for it again, not immediately, as if the pause itself had waited, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk before moving, slower than before, deliberate without purpose. The hum above did not change, but something in the room felt less sealed, like a door somewhere had been left slightly open, not enough to notice at first, only enough to shift the air. Down the corridor, the rhythm of movement continued, steady, unbroken, the soft glide and turn now aligning with the quiet inside the room rather than interrupting it. And when she lifted her eyes again, it was not toward the window but toward the reflection that carried that motion across the glass. The figure passed through the far end of the hallway again, this time closer by a few yards, pushing the machine with the same even pace, shoulders relaxed, gaze lowered to the floor ahead, as if the path did not require thought, only presence. He paused near a junction, adjusting the angle of the handle, with a small shift of his wrist, then continued, the sound resuming without urgency, Evelyn's hand hovered over the mug once more, but instead of withdrawing, she turned it slightly, aligning the handle in a new direction, then let it be, her fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary before resting flat against the surface of the desk. Her breathing changed by a fraction, not deeper, just more measured, as if matching something outside herself, and when the lights beyond her office dimmed another row, she did not look down at the phone this time, her gaze staying outward, catching the faint movement again as it slipped past the edge of the frame, present, then gone, leaving behind a rhythm that did not ask for anything in return. The elevator doors closed with a soft, padded thud that barely echoed, sealing her inside a space that felt smaller than it was, the mirrored walls reflecting her from 3 angles, none of them quite aligning, her posture slightly shifted in each one, as if even her reflection could not settle on a single version of her. She stood near the panel without pressing anything at first, her hand hovering over the buttons before finally selecting the ground floor, then letting it fall back to her side. Fingers brushing lightly against the seam of her coat, smoothing it once, then again, though it did not need it. The descent was smooth, almost unnoticeable, only marked by the faint numbers changing above the door, each one blinking into existence and disappearing just as quickly, and she found herself watching them longer than necessary, following the sequence down as if it required her attention. When the doors opened, the lobby greeted her with a different kind of quiet, wider, less contained, the marble floor holding onto the last traces of movement from earlier in the evening, now reduced to distant echoes that no longer belonged to anyone in particular. Her heels made a muted sound as she crossed toward the exit, each step measured without intention, her pace neither fast nor slow, just consistent, like something set on autopilot. Outside, the air was cooler than she expected, a thin breeze slipping through the space between buildings, brushing against her face and catching a loose strand of hair that she tucked behind her ear without thinking, her hand lingering there a second longer before dropping back to her side. The car unlocked with a soft click, headlights flickering briefly as she opened the door, then dimming again as she slid into the driver's seat, the interior wrapping around her in a familiar stillness that felt both contained and empty. She did not start the engine right away, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, just placed there as if testing the shape of it, her thumbs tracing the seam along the leather before stopping at a small imperfection near the edge, a spot worn smoother than the rest. The dashboard remained dark for a moment before she pressed the ignition, the screens lighting up in sequence, each display coming to life with quiet precision, a soft chime marking the transition from stillness to function, though nothing about it felt like movement. She adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, not to improve the angle but to center it, aligning it with the frame of the windshield, then nudged it again a fraction as if the first adjustment had not been enough. The radio turned on automatically, a low murmur of voices filling the space before she lowered the volume to just above silence, leaving only a faint presence of sound that blended with the hum of the engine. The drive home unfolded in a series of steady lights and empty intersections. The city at this hour moving in longer pauses, red lights holding a little longer than necessary, green lights arriving without urgency, and she followed them without thought, stopping, waiting, moving again, her gaze fixed forward but not focused on anything specific. At one intersection, she slowed more than needed, her foot hovering over the brake before pressing down gently. Even though the light was already green, a hesitation that passed without explanation before she continued through. The building where she lived rose quietly at the end of the block, its windows mostly dark, a few scattered lights suggesting other lives unfolding behind closed curtains, none of which reached her. She parked in her usual spot, aligning the car carefully within the lines, adjusting once, then again. Even though the first attempt had been fine, the second more about the act than the result. Inside, the apartment greeted her with a stillness that felt denser than the office, the kind that did not hum or echo, but simply held its shape, the air untouched since she had left that morning. She set her keys down in the same place, a small dish near the entry, the metal making a soft, contained sound as it settled, then removed her coat slowly, hanging it with a precise motion that ended in a slight adjustment of the sleeve, smoothing a crease that would have fallen out on its own. The kitchen light flicked on, casting a warm glow that stopped short of the living room, leaving the rest of the space in a softer shadow, and she moved through it without turning on additional lights, navigating by memory more than sight. The refrigerator door opened, the cool air brushing against her hand as she reached for a bottle of water, unscrewing the cap but not drinking immediately, instead placing it on the counter and standing there for a moment, her gaze resting on the surface of the granite as if it might offer something back. She took a sip finally, small, controlled, then set the bottle down again, not finishing it, not closing it either, just leaving it as it was. In the bedroom, she paused at the edge of the bed before sitting, her weight lowering slowly, the mattress dipping slightly beneath her, and for a moment she did not move at all, her hands resting on her knees, her shoulders slightly forward, as if she had been about to stand again and had forgotten why. The silence here was different, deeper, without the distant rhythm of wheels or the hum of overhead lights, and yet, as she leaned back and let her head rest against the wall, there was a faint impression of that earlier rhythm, not heard but remembered, the steady, unhurried movement that had passed through the hallway without stopping, without asking, and it lingered for a second longer than anything else had that night before fading into the same quiet that filled the room. The office felt slightly different when she returned, though nothing in it had changed, the same corridor stretching ahead, the same glass reflecting the same quiet. But the air held a faint sense of familiarity now, as if it had been waiting rather than simply existing. She stepped inside without turning on the main lights, leaving most of the floor in a dim, even shadow, the glow from the city slipping through the windows and long, softened lines that rested across the desk where she had been sitting the night before. Her bag settled into the chair beside her with a muted shift of fabric, not quite placed, not quite dropped, and she remained standing for a moment longer than needed, her hand still resting on the back of the chair before she finally lowered herself into it, slower this time, as if matching something she had not yet named. The phone lay where she had left it, aligned near the edge, and she did not reach for it immediately, her gaze moving instead toward the reflection in the glass, catching the hallway behind her in a faint overlay of motion and stillness. Somewhere down that hallway, the familiar sound returned, the quiet glide of wheels tracing the same path as before, steady, unhurried, and when it came into view at the edge of her reflection, she did not look away right away, her eyes holding there just a second longer than they had the night before, not studying, not questioning, simply noticing that it was there again. Malcolm moved through the space. With the same rhythm, shoulders relaxed, hands guiding the handle in a slow arc, his steps measured in a way that did not demand attention, only presence. And as he reached the section near her office, he paused briefly, not turning toward her, but adjusting the position of a small caution sign near the wall, nudging it a few inches to the left so it aligned with the seam in the floor tiles, then continuing forward without breaking the pace he had already set. Evelyn's hand moved toward the phone, then stopped halfway, her fingers hovering above it before shifting direction, sliding instead to the edge of the desk, where she traced a faint line along the surface, her fingertip following the grain in a slow, absent motion before lifting away. The overhead lights remained on for a moment longer than they had the previous night, then one section dimmed, followed by another, the transition soft and almost imperceptible, leaving her space outlined rather than isolated, the light around her thinning but not disappearing. She leaned back slightly, the chair tilting just enough to change the angle of her view, bringing more of the hallway into the reflection. And for a brief moment, she caught Malcolm again as he passed beyond the doorway, the sound of the machine fading with him, not abrupt, just gradually less present, like a tide moving out. Her breathing slowed to match the quiet, each inhale stretching a fraction longer, each exhale settling more evenly. And when she finally picked up the phone, she did not wake the screen right away, her thumb resting along the edge as if considering the act itself before deciding against it. Instead, she set it back down, not in the exact same position, but a few inches closer to her this time, the shift small enough to go unnoticed by anyone else, but different enough that her hand paused after releasing it, registering the change without correcting it. In the distance, the last row of lights dimmed, leaving the corridor in a deeper shade, but the area around her remained softly lit, not bright, not dark, just enough to hold its shape, and she stayed there a moment longer than she had the night before, not moving, not leaving, simply existing within the same space. With the same quiet, now carrying a faint awareness of something steady passing through it, again and again, without asking to be seen. The pattern settled into the room before she noticed it had formed, not announced, not marked by any clear beginning, just something that had started repeating without asking for attention. She arrived later than the night before, the hallway already dimmed in sections, the light in her office still on, waiting in that quiet, neutral way that suggested nothing had been disturbed, and she paused just inside the doorway, her hand still resting against the frame, as if measuring whether to step fully into it or remain there a moment longer, the space holding its shape. Without her, when she did move forward, it was slower than usual, her heels making a softer sound against the floor, each step landing with less certainty, not hesitant, just unhurried in a way that did not belong to the pace she kept during the day. The chair was exactly where she had left it, angled slightly off from the desk, and instead of correcting it immediately, she stood behind it, fingers resting lightly along the back, tracing the seam of the leather with a small, absent motion, before easing it forward by an inch, not aligning it perfectly, just enough to sit. The phone remained within reach, closer than before, and she glanced at it without picking it up, her gaze passing over it, as if acknowledging its presence without needing to engage, her hand moving instead to the edge of the desk, where she pressed her fingertips down lightly, feeling the surface before releasing it. The overhead lights held steady a little longer tonight, the dimming delayed by seconds that stretched just enough to be noticed, and in that extended brightness, the reflection in the glass sharpened slightly, carrying the hallway behind her in clearer detail. The sound came not long after, the same measured glide, steady and unbroken, entering the space with the same consistency it had before, but now it seemed to arrive sooner, or perhaps she was simply aware of it earlier. She did not turn right away, her head remaining angled toward the desk, but her eyes shifted toward the reflection, catching the movement as it crossed into view, the figure passing along the corridor with the same rhythm, the same unchanging pace, as if time moved differently for him, or perhaps as if he did not measure it the same way. Malcolm reached the section just beyond her office and slowed slightly, not stopping, but adjusting the path of the machine with a subtle turn, guiding it along the edge where the floor met the wall, his hand steady on the handle, the motion precise without appearing deliberate. Near him, a small waste bin sat a few inches out of place, angled awkwardly toward the corridor, and without breaking his stride completely, he nudged it gently with the side of his shoe, then reached down and turned it so it faced inward, aligning it with the others along the wall before continuing on. The action so small it might have gone unnoticed, except that it did not. Evelyn's gaze lingered a fraction longer than before, not following him fully, but not returning immediately to the desk either, her attention suspended somewhere between the two, her breathing adjusting again, not deeper, not faster, just more even, as if something in the room had set a quieter pace she had begun to match. She shifted in her chair, not to get comfortable, but to change her angle slightly, turning a few degrees so the hallway sat more directly in her peripheral vision rather than behind her reflection, a small adjustment that altered the way the space felt, opening it just enough to hold more than one point of focus. Her hand moved toward the coffee mug again, but instead of lifting it, she slid it a few inches closer, aligning it with the edge of the desk, then rotated it slightly, so the handle faced her more directly, a motion that ended in a brief pause, her fingers resting against the ceramic before pulling back. The lights beyond her office dimmed in sequence, one row, then another, the shift soft but noticeable, leaving the corridor in a layered gradient of shadow and light. And through that dimming, Malcolm's figure passed once more, farther now, the sound of the machine softening as it moved away, not disappearing, just receding into the same steady rhythm that had carried it through before. She did not look down at her phone again, not yet, her gaze remaining outward, holding onto the space a moment longer, as if the act of noticing had extended beyond its usual length, her posture settling into something less rigid, her shoulders lowering by a small degree that might not have registered to anyone else. Time moved without markers here, not counted in minutes, but in the repetition of small, familiar actions, the glide of wheels, the dimming of lights, the quiet hum above, and somewhere within that repetition, something had shifted, not enough to name, not enough to change what she did, but enough that she did not leave when she normally would have. She remained in her chair a little longer, her hands resting lightly against the desk, not working, not reaching, just present. The space around her no longer entirely empty, but not full either, holding a trace of something steady that returned each night, unchanged, unspoken, and quietly, without asking, began to matter. The night held steady around her, the same measured quiet stretching across the floor, but something in the air felt denser, as if the silence had settled deeper into the corners, lingering instead of passing through, and she remained at her desk longer than she had planned, her hands resting near the edge without reaching for anything. Her gaze not fixed, but drifting slowly between the faint reflection in the glass and the softened outline of the hallway beyond. The sound arrived again, right on time, or maybe just expected now. The low, even glide tracing its path through the corridor. And this time she did not need to look for it, her awareness catching it early, aligning with it before it entered her field of vision. Malcolm moved into view with the same unbroken rhythm, guiding the machine along the outer edge, his steps steady, shoulders loose, his presence carrying no urgency. And as he passed the opening to her office, he slowed, not enough to stop the motion completely, but enough to let it settle, his hand easing the handle to a pause near the wall. For a brief second, he looked toward the floor just inside her space, not at her, not at the desk, but at a small detail near the baseboard, where the shadow from the overhead light left a narrow strip dimmer than the rest, the kind of unevenness most people would not notice, and without drawing attention, he stepped inside just far enough to reach the wall panel, his movement quiet, deliberate without hesitation. His fingers found the switch, and instead of turning the main light on or off, he adjusted a secondary setting, dimming the overhead brightness by a fraction, then shifting it again until the light softened into a warmer tone, not darker, just less sharp. The edges of the room settling into a gentler contrast that eased the glare across the desk. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it altered the way the space held itself. The reflections in the glass no longer as harsh, the surface of the desk losing its cold sheen, the air between objects feeling less exposed. He paused a moment longer, as if checking the balance of it, then stepped back into the hallway, guiding the machine forward again without looking in her direction, the rhythm resuming exactly where it had left off. Uninterrupted, Evelyn's hand shifted slightly against the desk, not pulling back, not reaching forward, just adjusting position as the light settled around her, her fingers spreading a fraction as if testing the surface again under the softer glow. She glanced up, not fully turning, her eyes tracing the edge of the wall where the switch had been, then drifting toward the reflection where his figure had already moved past, the sound of the machine returning to its steady distance. Her shoulders lowered by a small degree, not enough to register as a deliberate movement, but enough that the line of her posture changed, easing the tension she had been holding without noticing it. She reached for the phone, her thumb brushing the side, but instead of waking the screen, she turned it face down on the desk, a motion that ended with a brief pause, her hand resting lightly on the back of it before lifting away. The room remained quiet, but the silence felt different now, less hollow, more contained, as if the space itself had adjusted to hold her more gently, and she stayed there, not moving to leave, not returning to any task, just existing within the same pattern that had been there all along, now carrying a shift so small it could have been missed, except that it was not, and it remained steady, like something placed carefully and left without explanation. The light held its softer edge as the minutes passed, not fading, not shifting back, simply staying where it had been placed, and she noticed it not all at once, but in the way her eyes no longer narrowed when she looked down at the desk, in the way the reflection in the glass lost its sharp outline and settled into something quieter, easier to look at without turning away. Her hand moved across the surface again, slower than before, not tracing anything this time, just resting there, her fingers relaxed instead of held together, and when she reached for the phone, she did not flip it over immediately, her thumb pressing lightly against the back before she slid it a few inches farther from her, not out of reach, just no longer at the center. The shift was small, almost incidental, but it stayed, and she did not correct it. The corridor beyond her office carried the same steady rhythm, the glide of movement returning in its usual path, and when it entered her peripheral view, she did not wait for the reflection. She turned slightly in her chair, not fully facing the hallway, just enough that she could see the edge of it without relying on the glass. Malcolm moved through the space as he always had, shoulders even, hands steady, guiding the machine along the same route, his pace unchanged, his attention fixed on the floor ahead, and as he reached the section near her office, he adjusted the handle with the same small motion, guiding it along the baseboard before. Continuing forward, nothing about his movement suggested awareness, nothing paused or shifted in response. And yet, as he passed, she remained turned a moment longer than necessary, her gaze following the path he had just taken, not tracking him directly, but holding the space he had occupied. She leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting near the edge of the desk, her posture no longer angled away, and for the first time, she reached for the coffee mug and lifted it, not to drink, but to feel its weight, turning it once in her hand before setting it down again without placing it exactly where it had been. The overhead lights dimmed another row, the transition slower tonight, or perhaps just more noticeable, the shift unfolding in a way that stretched the moment, and she watched it happen, not as a background change, but as something that moved through the room, altering it in real time. Her breathing followed that same slower pattern, each inhale drawn a fraction longer, each exhale settling without interruption. And when she glanced toward the wall panel where the light had been adjusted earlier, her eyes paused there, not questioning, not analyzing, just recognizing the difference between what had been and what was. The phone remained face down, untouched, and when it buzzed once, a soft vibration against the desk, she did not reach for it immediately, her hand hovering for a second before lowering back to the surface, leaving it where it was, the sound fading without acknowledgement. The corridor quieted again as the movement passed beyond her space, the rhythm receding but not disappearing, and she stayed where she was, not returning to the earlier pattern, not resuming the small, repetitive motions that had filled the time before. Instead, she adjusted her chair slightly, turning it a few degrees more toward the hallway, opening the angle between her and the space beyond, a change so subtle it might have seemed accidental, except that she did not turn it back. The room held that new alignment, the softer light, the quiet that no longer pressed as heavily, and she remained there within it, not fully at rest, not fully changed, but no longer moving through it the same way she had before. The difference carried in the way she let a moment extend instead of closing it, the way she allowed something to remain without needing to resolve it. And somewhere within that, the pattern shifted, not broken, but altered just enough that it could not return to what it had been. She did not reach for the phone again, not when the room settled into its usual quiet, not when the faint vibration came and went without sound, and instead her hand stayed where it was, resting flat against the desk, as if it had found a place it did not need to leave. The light above her remained softened, holding the same tone Malcolm had said earlier, and she noticed how it fell differently now, not just across the surface of the desk, but along the edge of the glass, diffusing the reflection into something less exact, less demanding, and she leaned back slightly, allowing that shift to stay without adjusting her position to correct it. The corridor carried its rhythm again, the low glide returning in its steady pattern, and when it entered her view, she did not turn immediately, letting it pass once before she angled her chair a fraction more, opening her line of sight without fully facing it, her movement slow enough that it felt like a continuation rather than a decision. Malcolm moved through the space as he always had, guiding the machine along the same path, pausing briefly near the wall to straighten a narrow strip of protective edging that had lifted slightly, pressing it back into place with a firm, careful motion before continuing, his pace unchanged, his attention contained within the work itself. She watched that small adjustment without following him afterward, her gaze returning to the desk, but not to the phone, instead settling on the coffee mug she had moved earlier, and she lifted it again, this time bringing it closer before setting it down nearer the center, not aligning it perfectly, just placing it where it felt balanced. The shift was minor, but it remained, and she did not undo it. The lights dimmed another row, the transition stretching slightly longer than before, and she noticed the way the hallway softened into shadow without losing its shape. The movement within it still visible, still steady, and her breathing followed that same lengthened pace, each inhale drawn without interruption, each exhale settling without urgency. She pushed her chair back a few inches, the legs sliding quietly against the floor, and stood, not to leave, but to step closer to the window, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the desk as she passed, not for support, just contact. The city below moved in its distant rhythm, headlights tracing slow lines through intersections, and she watched it for a moment longer than she usually would have, her shoulders lowering slightly as she rested her weight evenly between both feet, no longer leaning forward as if pulled toward something else. Behind her, the sound of the machine receded again, not disappearing, just moving farther down the corridor, and she turned back toward the desk after a moment, not quickly, not with purpose, just returning. She did not sit immediately, her hand resting on the back of the chair as it had earlier, but instead of adjusting it, she left it as it was, stepping around to the side and sitting at a slightly different angle than before, facing neither fully forward nor fully toward the hallway, a position that allowed both spaces to exist within her view without needing to choose. The phone remained face down, untouched, and she left it there, her hand moving past it to rest near the edge again, her fingers relaxed, not searching for anything. The room held its quieter balance, the lights steady, the sound distant but present, and she stayed within it longer than she had on any night before, not waiting, not filling the time, just allowing it to pass without marking it. The difference not in what she did, but in what she no longer repeated, the absence of that earlier pattern leaving behind a space that felt less empty, not full, but no longer hollow either, and she remained there, within that subtle shift, as the night moved on without asking her to follow. The room remained as it was, but it no longer held her the same way, the softened light settling into the edges of the desk, the glass, the floor, not pressing against her but resting there, steady and even, and she stayed seated for a moment longer without shifting, her hands relaxed against the surface, her shoulders no longer angled forward as if reaching for something that never came. The corridor carried its familiar rhythm once more, the quiet glide passing through the space without interruption, Malcolm moving along the same path, guiding the machine with the same measured pace, stopping briefly to straighten a loose cable near the wall before continuing, his presence unchanged, unspoken, part of the structure of the night rather than separate from it. She noticed the movement, not by turning fully, but by the way her gaze lifted just slightly, catching the edge of it, then letting it pass without following, her attention returning not to the phone, not to the reflection, but to the desk itself. The phone remained face down where she had left it, still within reach, but no longer central, and when her hand moved, it did not go toward it. Instead, sliding to the side of the desk where her bag rested, her fingers brushing against the strap before. She lifted it, not quickly, not with urgency, just a quiet motion that completed itself without hesitation. She stood, the chair shifting back a few inches with a soft sound against the floor, and for a second she remained there, upright, not looking at anything in particular, just holding the space in front of her without filling it. The city beyond the window moved in its distant rhythm, lights passing through intersections, the slow flow continuing without demand, and she glanced toward it. Briefly, not lingering, just acknowledging it before turning back. Her hand reached toward the coffee mug, not to move it into place, not to correct it, but to lift it slightly and carry it with her, a small adjustment that left the desk no longer arranged in the same quiet repetition it had held for nights before. She stepped away from the desk without returning to sit again, her pace even, unforced, crossing the room toward the door, her steps landing softly, not delayed, not rushed, behind her. The light remained on, still warm, still steady, not switched off, not left by accident, just left as it was. In the corridor, the sound of the machine continued, moving farther down the hall, the rhythm consistent, fading gradually as distance increased, not ending, just continuing beyond her space. She paused briefly at the doorway, her hand resting against the frame, not holding on. just touching it for a second longer than necessary before letting it fall away. Then she stepped into the hallway, the door remaining open behind her, the light from the office spilling out in a soft line across the floor, joining the dimmed rows beyond without standing apart. The night carried on around her, but it no longer felt as though she was waiting inside it. And as she walked forward, her path did not circle back, did not repeat. It simply moved ahead, steady and quiet, leaving behind a room that no longer needed her to stay. If this quiet moment felt familiar, you can share your thoughts and follow along for more stories like this. Thank you.